Welcome to Theology 2, Lesson 15. We're still in Eschatology and we are looking at the book of Revelation, and we'll also be examining the Millennium mentioned in Revelation chapter 20. Once again, we begin with this chart with the four categories that comprise eschatology. We finished up the last lesson with explaining the differences between the dispensational and non dispensational views of the book of Daniel, specifically Daniel's 70 weeks, because how we understand Daniel's 70 weeks is going to affect how we approach the book of Revelation. If you believe the dispensationalist approach to Daniel's 70 weeks and you place a gap between the 69th and 70th weeks, then you probably view the 70th week as the Great Tribulation, or the period described in the book of Revelation, chapters 6 through 19, which means that you must make those events fit within the time frame of 7 years. Thus, you have to approach Revelation with a preconceived view instead of just letting the text and the narrative explain itself. So, in this lesson, we're going to briefly look at the four basic approaches to Revelation. Then, we're going to look at the timeline of Revelation, whether the events described in the visions are linear or recapitulations. And finally, we will look briefly at the four views of the millennium. The first view we're going to look at is the futurist view, which is probably the one we're most familiar with. In a sense, each view maintains or maintained a type of futurism to some extent. But when we say futurist, we mean that the events depicted in Revelation chapters 6 through 22 are all limited to the time period, 7 years or shorter, just prior to the parousia or second coming of Jesus Christ. The term parousia is the Greek word for coming or appearing, and it is used as a technical term to describe the second coming of Jesus Christ. So when you hear me say parousia, just automatically understand that we're talking about the second coming of Jesus Christ. And as we are going to see, each of these views, each of these schools of interpretation for the book of Revelation, has its own pros and cons. So with futurism, the pro is that this view understands the visions as prophecy per the words of Revelation 1 and 3. However, they limit the context and relevance of the book of Revelation to the final audience, meaning that unless you're the actual people upon whom these events can or will take place, then the book has very little, if any, relevance to your life at all, which then limits the application of Revelation 1:3, that the verse that identifies this book as prophecy, but it also proclaims a blessing upon those who read, hear, and obey the words written. So, whereas futurism understands the visions as prophecy, it limits the context and relevance only to that final audience. The next view is historicism, which views the book of Revelation as describing the entire history of the church from Pentecost to the parousia. So, in historicism, when the first seal is broken and the rider on the white horse comes forth, a historicist would view this rider as Christ or the spread of the gospel rather than the Antichrist like a futurist would believe. Historicists also believe that Revelation predicted such events as the Islamic invasion of Jerusalem, the Crusades, the Reformation, and even the invention of Gutenberg's printing press, which is how they interpret the angel with the little book in Revelation 10:2. You can read Albert Barnes' notes on the whole Bible and look at his comments throughout Revelation, and he gives the historicist approach. Historicism was the view of the Reformers and the Great Awakening. The majority of your Church of Christ denomination and Christian church still hold to historicism. I even know some Oneness Pentecostals that are historicists. I worked with a man who believes the Oneness doctrine, although he doesn't necessarily identify as a Pentecostal per se. And he's written a couple of books on this subject, and he's a historicist. His name is Robert Caringola, Caringola, and his books are available on Amazon if anyone is interested in reading a oneness view of historicism. I also have a UPCI pastor friend who is a staunch historicist and says that his family has always been historicist. His dad was, his grandfather, and he's like a sixth or seventh generation Pentecost, which some of his family were even at the merger in 1945. So apparently, the historicist view uh, that has been held for quite some time among oneness Pentecostals. And in a sense, Brother Baxter held to some kind of quasi historicism. I'm not sure if you can category his view as futurist or historicist or a blending of the two. Well, the pros to historicism is that it at least makes the book of Revelation applicable and relevant to every generation. But the cons to historicism is that it tries to explain the visions too specifically with historical movements. I mean, personally, I think it's a huge stretch to say that the angel with the little book, the little Biblos in Revelation 10, is a reference to the Wycliffe Bible or Gutenberg's printing press. To me, that sounds like people living in the 15th century trying to apply their 15th century culture into the text, just like we talked about with people trying to apply a 20th or 21st century culture into the book of Daniel by explaining the beasts as modern political powers. The next interpretive school is that of idealism, which interprets Revelation as a symbolic portrayal of good versus evil, God versus the devil. Karl Barth is a famous theologian who held this view. Barth said that eschatology was a representation of existential truths to bring hope to martyrs and persecuted Christians. So, to an idealist, symbols such as the beast in Revelation 13 wouldn't represent any actual historical political powers, but would denote types of social injustices. And then the great harlot of Revelation 17 and 18 would represent the struggles of false religion without actually identifying the harlot with any particular religion. So, the pros of idealism is that it recognizes the apocalyptic narrative of Revelation. And that's one thing you're going to get into if you haven't already in your academic journey, and that's understanding narratives, genres, and motifs of the Bible. And I'm not familiar with who all teaches, whether full time or adjunct with Urshan College, but I've read Peter Wright's master's thesis, and he would be a good source on recognizing narratives, genres, and motifs in Revelation, which is what he wrote on. He wrote on the Nero revived motif. That was his master's thesis. Some of the Urshan graduate school professors you can look to for more in depth studies on biblical narrative are Dr. Jeff Brickle, aka Gaius of St. Charles, or the Brickle as we call him. Dr. Jeremy Painter, I mean, the guy's first PhD is in literature, which is why I chose him as my advisor for my MDiv thesis, which I happen to have also written on eschatology for my MDiv thesis. And then Dr. Chris Paris, I mean, his PhD dissertation was on narrative criticism. And so don't misunderstand, I'm not saying any of these professors hold to an idealistic view of Revelation. I'm just saying that they are great sources of information on narrative criticism. Now, the con to idealism though, is that it oversimplifies the book of Revelation too much to where it makes the symbols and narrative kind of meaningless or they don't identify with any past or future historical events. The final interpretive view of these four is that of the preterist view. Now, you may have heard of preterism. Preterism is a bad word among oneness Pentecostals. But do we really understand what preterism is? This is something we had to have a roundtable meeting about in eschatology class at UGST because there was this one brother in particular that kept calling everything he didn't understand preterism. And I thought that was just his misunderstanding of preterism, but then I started reading some of our fellow brethren, and I'm speaking specifically of UPCI brethren, and how they portray preterism, and either they don't truly know what preterism is, or they are guilty of painting with a broad brush and using the term preterist as like a scare tactic, like the political left does with the word homophobe, which is why I mentioned in a previous lesson that my friends and I joke that everything is preterist. Brother Weatherly, do you believe in paying tithes? Of course I believe in paying my tithes. If you don't pay your tithes, you're a preterist. Now, don't misunderstand, I'm not a preterist at all. I think full preterism is a heresy because it denies the literal second coming of Christ and the bodily resurrection of the saints. And I believe partial preterism is an error because it renders the book of Revelation nonsensical. And I'll explain all of that more clearly in just a moment. But we've got to accurately describe preterism, especially if we're going to put out books against it or write a position paper against it. For example, the 2005 UPCI position paper, The Coming of the Lord, states, "We reject preterist notions that the prophecies of Revelation 4 through 19 were fulfilled prior to AD 70, comma, that Satan is bound, comma, and that we are now living during the 1,000 years described in Revelation 20." And only one of those two or one of those three statements is accurate. Full preterists do not believe that Satan is currently bound and that we are now living in the 1,000 years of Revelation 20. Neither do partial preterists. What the writer of this position paper did was blend views from preterism with amillennialism, which are not synonymous terms, and thus he created some kind of new eschatological casserole that's not an accurate description of either preterism or amillennialism. So, what is preterism? The term preterism comes from the Latin word praeter, which means past. Preterism divides into two groups, full and partial preterist. Both groups believe that Revelation chapters 6 through 19 predict the 45 months of persecution just prior to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, which they identify the great harlot as the city of Jerusalem. The difference between full and partial preterists, though, is that a full preterist believes that the millennium, the 1,000 years of Revelation 20, actually describes the 40 or so years from Calvary to AD 70, and that believers have transcended beyond the millennium into the new heaven and earth, which they view as symbolic of the church. Whereas partial preterists believe that Revelation 20 through 22 is still future, but the vast majority of partial preterists are postmillennial, not amillennial. So why there's a connection between preterism and amillennialism in our position paper, I'm not sure. It's probably based upon one random person. Some full preterists believe that there was some kind of bodily resurrection just prior to AD 70, but the majority of full preterists reject that Paul ever taught an actual bodily resurrection or literal return of Christ, which is why, in my opinion, full preterism should be viewed as a heresy. If you want to understand more about preterism from actual preterists, then I would suggest reading Max King or Don Preston. They are two prominent names among full preterists. Don Preston is still alive today, and he is one of the main line full preterists of today. And then if you're interested in partial preterism, I would read R.C. Sproul or Ken Gentry. Ken Gentry is probably the mainline partial preterist of the 21st century. So, what are the pros, if any, to partial preterism? Somebody says none. Well, no, there's some. There's at least one. Well, at least they make the book of Revelation applicable to the first century audience, as Revelation 1:3 those who hear and obey. And that's more than what futurism does. Futurism doesn't even make the book applicable to the first century audience, to the audience that John actually was sending the book to. But the con to preterism is that they make the book of Revelation only applicable to the first century audience. Plus, both full and partial preterism make the entire make the entire book of Revelation nonsensical. And what I mean by that is, if Revelation is a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the 45 months of persecution leading up to this destruction, then why did Jesus have John send the letter to the seven churches in the opposite direction? Plus, if Revelation predicted the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, then this would likewise require a very early date in writing, which is virtually logistically impossible. Now, to support an early date for Revelation, preterists declare that he expected these prophecies to unfold in his lifetime based upon the timing terms in the opening of Revelation, the word takos, soon, and engus, near. However, neither takos or entake, soon or shortly, nor engus, near at hand, demand a fulfillment within John's lifetime. Rather, one can understand these terms qualitatively to indicate speed, quickness, or imminence. The phrase "intake" shortly in Revelation 1 and 1 also occurs in Luke 18:8, where it's translated speedily. And here the context is obviously not a short time span. In Luke 18:6 through 8, the judge bears long with the elect who cry out day and night for vengeance. Yet Jesus proclaimed that the judge would avenge them in take, speedily. The phrase in take simply means that the events will come suddenly or immediately once the appointed time arrives. Another strong argument against an early writing of AD 66 maybe involves the logistic improbabilities that it would even reach the intended audience in sufficient time. So, according to preterists, Revelation anticipated the destruction of Jerusalem in August of AD 70, the death of Nero, June of AD 68, and the formal imperial engagement of the Jewish War, spring of AD 67. So, if John wrote Revelation as a prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem and the 42-month tribulation preceding it, then he had to write no later than the spring of AD 67. Thus, preterism depends on an early date. If the date's wrong, then of necessity the interpretation is also wrong. And Mark Hitchcock observes, if Revelation was written in AD 65 to 66 and the events of Revelation 1 through 20 were fulfilled soon in the events of somewhere between AD 64 to AD 70, as partial preterists and full preterists maintain, then the bulk of the book was already fulfilled before most Christians ever heard or read its contents. By the time the book was written by John on Patmos and was then copied and carried by the messengers of the seven churches and then recopied and widely disseminated, the prophesied events would have already occurred. The powerful prophetic message of the apocalypse would have been one great anticlimax. I mean, think about it. This is the 21st century, and we can type a letter through email and send it instantly, but that's not how it worked in the first century. I mean, here's John on the island of Patmos writing a letter. He's got to get it off the island. First of all, we don't know when he got off that island to send it, or when someone came to visit him to send that letter to the seven churches of Asia. And then it wasn't like they had the Pony Express or anything. They had to walk, possibly ride by donkey, or some kind of beast of burden, but it was still a slow process to start in Ephesus and then work your way around through the seven churches of Asia. Likewise, if John wrote Revelation as a prophecy and a warning of the destruction of Jerusalem, why did he address and send it to seven churches in the opposite direction from Jerusalem? Notice the seven churches of Asia in that box, and then I have Jerusalem circled and highlighted in that oval shape. Notice how far away they are from Jerusalem. I mean, for example, Pergamus, the northernmost of the seven churches of Asia, which is now Bergama, Turkey, lies approximately 1,143 miles away from Jerusalem. How would the inhabitants of Pergamus been at risk of a war so great a distance away? Now, this would compare to prophetically warning the churches in Florida to flee the terror attacks in New York on 9/11. A preterist interpretation also overlooks the universal judgment, not just Jerusalem, described in the Apocalypse. Thus, preterism renders the prophetic purpose of Revelation not only nonsensical, but also illogical. So someone says, well, Brother Weatherly, since each view has pros and cons, which view is the correct view? To which I would answer, yes. You see, the issue with narrowing down one interpretive approach stems from trying to narrow revelation down to one kind of literary genre. While many scholars quickly identify Revelation as an apocalyptic writing due to its strange visions, gruesome monsters, and confusing repetitions, the opening prologue of Revelation seems to suggest that it belongs to three types of literary genres: apocalypse, prophecy, and epistle. Richard Bauckham classifies Revelation as an apocalyptic prophecy in the form of an epistle circulated through the seven churches in Asia Minor. In agreement, D.A. Carson, Douglas Moo, and Leon Morris describe Revelation as a prophecy cast in an apocalyptic mold and written down in a letter form. Since Revelation combines the literary genres of apocalypse, prophecy, and epistle, placing it strictly within one interpretive method becomes difficult. As Dr. Brickell notes in his 2002 symposium paper, Interpreting the Apocalypse, quote, this book has been, is, and will continue to be controversial simply because it defiantly resists casual interpretation, end quote. In fact, expositors commonly overlap aspects of each interpretive method, or they combine the stronger elements of each view, and they commonly refer to this as an eclectic approach to revelation. Commentators such as Robert Mounts, Grant Osborne, who wrote the commentary for the Baker Exegetical Series, N.T. Wright, G.K. Bill, and Craig Keener all utilize this eclectic approach. Christ commanded John to write the things which you have seen, the things which are, and the things which will take place after this, Revelation 1:19, may hold the key to any temporal framework of interpretation. Given the contrast between the things which are and the things which will take place, it may be best to approach the apocalypse utilizing a synthesis of views which embraces a form of already, not yet hermeneutics. In this manner, students interpret the first century historical cultural background of Revelation as the backdrop for the final consummation of the apocalyptic prophecies. As G.K. Bill explains, some distinguish prophecy from apocalyptic on the basis that the former sees divine deliverance in the midst of history, while the latter expects it at the end of history. But Revelation reflects an already and not yet approach to end time salvation, which incorporates both prophetic and apocalyptic things. Hence, while the apocalypse sits firmly rooted in the first century, it still maintains an unquestionably ongoing relevance for future generations. And a similar already not yet pattern appears in the Olivet Discourse as the beginnings of sorrow and the end is not yet, Matthew 24, 6 through 8, where the destruction of Jerusalem serves as the historical backdrop of the parousia at the final eschaton. Likewise, an already not yet concept occurs in Revelation with the martyred saints already in heaven who are told to wait a little longer until their fellow servants are killed. So some visions, such as Revelation chapters 12 through 13, portray a panoramic history, which includes the birth of Christ, first century persecution, and the final eschatological events. Exactly what applies as already or not yet may vary from commentator to commentator. Alan Johnson rightly observes that since few of these interpretive questions can be answered dogmatically, there is a need for tolerance of divergent approaches in the hope that the Holy Spirit may use open minded discussion to bring us further into the meaning of the apocalypse. Now, my personal view, therefore, maintains that the seals, trumpets, and vials primarily describe the final period of the Great Tribulation just prior to the physical return of Christ, but draws upon first century persecution and the Antichrist motif of the Nero Redivivus legend. The overarching theme of Revelation then encourages the church through persecution of its final hope in the parousia and resurrection. Now, the next thing we're going to deal with is how to interpret the time frame of the visions in Revelation. And by that I mean, do we understand these visions in a linear flow, or are they a retelling of the same events? Now, I won't spend a lot of time on this except to show you a comparison of the views. And so here we have Clarence Larkin's Book of Revelation chart, which really set the standard for dispensationalist views. This chart has been remade and updated over the years, but as you can see, dispensationalists typically view the events of Revelation as occurring in a linear fashion, meaning that the seven seals come first, followed by the seven trumpets, and then followed by the seven vials, which end with the parousia of Jesus Christ. Whereas our reading of a book occurs in a linear fashion, the narrative of each chapter doesn't always follow chronologically. Think about the classic novel, A Tale of Two Cities. The first chapter opens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. Then chapter 2 opens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And the reader is like, wait, didn't I just read that in the previous chapter? Yes. And that's what's called recapitulation, a retelling of the same story or same events from a different perspective. So the dispensationalist view follows a linear approach where the seals, trumpets, and vials describe three separate judgments which occur chronologically, one after the other, before the parousia in chapter 19. Whereas non-dispensationalists typically follow the recapitulation view that the seals, trumpets, and vials all describe the same judgment told in three separate visions, all of which end with the parousia or second coming of Christ, which is described in more detail in Revelation chapter 19. The recapitulation view finds support first in the pattern of the seals, trumpets, and vials, in that each one contains a parenthetical interlude between the sixth and the seventh of each order. Likewise, the trumpets and vials follow the same order of judgments upon the earth, sea, fresh water, etc., with each of the seventh seal, trumpet, and vial concluding with noises, thunders, lightnings, and earthquakes. This repetition in patterns words, and phrases all suggest the same story being told through different visions. And this notion of recapitulation and prophecy occurs all throughout the Bible. I mean, think about Joseph's dream of the sheaves and his dream of the stars. Same story, told two different ways. Nebuchadnezzar's image and Daniel's beast. Again, same story, retold in different visions. Once again, this view of narrative recapitulation has been held for centuries. Victorinus in AD 270, representing one of the earliest known full commentaries of Revelation, declared that the apocalyptic visions were a retelling of the same story. Many commentators ascribe to this view of recapitulation, such as Eckhart Mueller, G.R. Beasley Murray, Grant Osborne, N.T. Wright, Robert Mounts, G.K. Bill, Eugene Boring, and Craig Keener, who admits that it is difficult to interpret most of Revelation as a continuous chronological account. He says the seals, the trumpets, and the vials appear to be parallel in their inception and completion. Several literary devices point to recapitulation in the apocalyptic narrative. For example, evidence for recapitulation appears in the wrath motif of Revelation. Each set of judgments, the seals, the trumpets, the vials, specifically mention the time of God's wrath as present. The cosmic signs of the sixth seal announce the wrath of the Lamb and the great day of his wrath, Revelation 6:16 through 17. Likewise, the sounding of the seventh trumpet signifies that Christ's wrath has come and the time of the dead that they should be judged, Revelation 11:18. Well, if the trumpets occur subsequent to the seals, then Christ's wrath would have already come prior to the sounding of the seventh trumpet, unless these judgments describe the same events. Again, in Revelation 14:10 through 19, the angel announces the wrath of God at the time of the harvest, describing the result of this wrath as the blood came out of the winepress up to the horses' bridles, Revelation 14:20. This language parallels perfectly with the parousia mentioned in Revelation 19 of the rider on the white horse who he himself treads the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of Almighty God, Revelation 19:15. Yet prior to this vision, John describes the seven angels having the seven last plagues, for in them the wrath of God is complete. And that word complete is the same word used in Revelation 10:7 to describe the mystery of God as complete. If Revelation depicts these apocalyptic events in a chronological fashion rather than a retelling or a recapitulation, then how can Revelation 15:1 describe God's wrath as complete with the bowls of wrath and yet describe the word of God later riding a white horse treading the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God in 19:5? Now, when we talk about recapitulation, we're not talking about an exact reproduction with mechanical or photographic likeness. We realize that there are some slight differences, but I think that the glaring similarities point to a recapitulation or retelling of the same apocalyptic story. What the seven seals describe in symbols, the trumpets and vials go into more detail within the apocalyptic visions. The seven seals then seem to follow the pattern of the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24 of false Christ, wars and rumors of war, famines and pestilence, the beginnings of sorrow, the martyrdoms, cosmic disturbances like the sun becoming black like sackcloth and the moon to blood, which announces the parousia of Jesus Christ when the angels gather the elect from the uttermost parts of the earth to the uttermost parts of heaven. And I definitely think that you can see a recapitulation in the trumpets and the vials, where the first of each order affects the earth, the second the sea, the third rivers and spring waters. The fourth affects the sun. The fifth describes darkness and torment. And the sixth trumpet and vial involve the Euphrates River. Then notice that the seventh seal, seventh trumpet, and seventh vial all conclude with noises, thunders, lightnings, and earthquake. And we'll talk a little bit more about recapitulation in the final lesson on the rapture and the parousia. So now in this final section of the lesson, we're going to look briefly at the four views of the millennium. When we talk about the millennium, we are talking about Revelation chapter 20, which describes 1,000 years in which the devil is bound in order that he might not deceive the nations, and those who had been beheaded for their witness rule and reign with Christ. Now, we're not even going to get into issues like restored temples, the gathering of Israel, or things like that. We are just interested in where Revelation 20 fits in eschatology and the narrative of the book of Revelation. The first view I want to show you is transmillennialism. Now, with the exception of this class, this may be a brand new term for you. This is the view that full preterists ascribe to, and they are the ones that actually came up with this term. To a full preterist, the millennium, or 1,000 years of Revelation 20, actually describes the 40 so years between Christ's crucifixion and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And now believers have supposedly transcended the millennium into the new heaven and new earth, which they say is figurative language for the church. And I don't want to dive too deep into refuting this, except to say that the number 1,000 in scriptures never means anything less than 1,000. Now, 1,000 can mean more than 1,000, and we'll discuss that in just a bit, but it never means less than 1,000. So at the outset, for the preterist to say that by 1,000 years, John really meant 40 years just seems ridiculous. Now we will look at premillennialism, specifically as concerns the outline of the book of Revelation. There's all kinds of nuances and different views of premillennialism. There's dispensational premillennialism, there is historic premillennialism, and we're not even going to cover those. But basically, premillennialism is the view that Revelation 19 describes Christ's second coming, which occurs chronologically before or pre Revelation 20, which is the millennium. This view also maintains that Revelation 20 describes a literal period of 1,000 years after Christ returns, in which the devil will be bound and resurrected believers reign with Christ for 1,000 years. But at the end of the 1,000 years, the devil is released from the abyss and he goes out to deceive the nations and gather the armies against God, which ends with fire falling from heaven and devouring the armies. Now, a serious hurdle for premillennialism to jump is who are these inhabitants of the millennium that the devil eventually deceives and gathers together against the people of God? Now, obviously, they can't be resurrected immortal believers who have already conquered death, according to 1 Corinthians 15. So, premillennialists say that these will be the unbelieving nations who enter into the millennium. But 2 Thessalonians 1 7 through 9 and Revelation 19 17 through 18 seem to describe all the unbelievers being destroyed at the second coming, which would then leave no unbelievers to inhabit the millennium. So that's a big hurdle for premillennialism to jump. Millennial view is postmillennialism. Postmillennialism was the view prominently held during the Great Awakening and by men such as John Wesley. Postmillennialism does not view Revelation 19 as a description of Christ's second coming. Rather, it interprets it more like the idealist and say that it's a symbol of the victory of the spread of the gospel. So, postmillennialism sees the gospel spreading and becoming so victorious that it ushers in a golden age of the millennium. There were some overtones of this in very early Pentecost, since some of the early Pentecostals came from Wesleyan holiness. Now, a couple of big hurdles for post millennialism to jump are: one, they oversimplify the language of Revelation 19, which on the surface just seems to read like the second coming of Jesus Christ. And then two, the view almost sees the victory of the gospel in terms of universalism, where everyone will eventually be saved. And then three, contrary to their concept of a golden age of things getting better and better and better, the New Testament describes the last days as progressively getting worse and worse and worse until the final eschaton, with the parousia, or the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, as mentioned, postmillennialism was the view of the Great Awakening, especially in America, but there was this little thing called the American Civil War, and all that death and destruction of the Civil War really clashed with their golden age view that postmillennialism kind of then went out of vogue toward the end of the 1800s. And so partial preterist and idealist are typically post millennial. Ken Gentry, who is a partial preterist, is also one of the premier proponents of post millennialism. And then finally, we have amillennialism or amillennialism. I've heard it pronounced either way. Amillennialism sees the millennium of Revelation 20 as a recapitulation of the entire apocalyptic narrative and church age. So in this case, the term 1,000 years is not a literal 1,000 years, but it's more like a figurative term, like how the Lord owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, you say the Lord does own the cattle on 1,000 hills. Of course he does. But he also owns the cattle on hills 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, and so on. So, amillennialists also see Satan's gathering of the nations at the end of the millennium as a recapitulation of the gathering of the nations mentioned earlier in Revelation. Thus, when Revelation 20 and 9 describes fire falling from heaven and destroying these armies, amillennialists see this as a retelling of the parousia described in Revelation 19. Now, a couple of big hurdles for amillennialists to jump are: number one, if the millennium describes or runs parallel with the church age, then how exactly is the devil bound in the abyss? And then two, what is the first resurrection mentioned in Revelation 25 to 6? Most historicists and many futurists ascribe to amillennialism. In fact, it is the most widely held view. There are entire denominations who are amillennialist. Your Orthodox churches, Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, any quote Orthodox church, your Church of Christ denomination, the Christian church, a lot of Presbyterians, Lutherans, and Baptists, as well as Pentecostals, ascribe to amillennialism. And I want to reiterate that amillennialism is not synonymous with preterism. This is either a gross misunderstanding of preterism by some of our oneness authors, or they are guilty of painting preterism with too broad of a brush. And now some of you are probably wondering, well, Brother Weatherly, which view is correct? And my answer is, I like the way Craig Keener describes his view. In a YouTube video with Remnant Radio, Craig Keener said that he leans toward premillennialism, but he could also just as easily defend amillennialism. Now, I'm definitely not transmillennial or postmillennial in the sense of some golden age of the gospel, but I am very open to amillennialism, and I could just as easily defend premillennialism, at least historic premillennialism as taught by G.E. Ladd. I wouldn't defend dispensationalist premillennialism like Clarence Larkin and C.I. Scofield, but I think that both premillennialism and amillennialism have hurdles to jump. It's just an issue of who jumps the hurdles the best. So, your food for thought, this module, your first two questions for the discussion post. Number one, discuss the four primary approaches to interpreting the book of Revelation: preterism, historicism, futurism, and idealism. Which view do you believe is most consistent, or is there an overlapping of views? Two, discuss the three primary views of the millennium. Now, I'm not going to include transmillennialism because that is a full preterist view. Discuss the three primary views on the millennium: premillennial, postmillennial, and amillennial. Discuss the pros and cons of each view. Is a particular view on the millennium important to the apostolic faith? And I'll just throw this out there that there are Pentecostal organizations around the world that are pulling back more and more from specific eschatological positions on the rapture and the millennium, with the exception of saying that they believe in the literal second coming of Jesus Christ. So, is it important that we have a doctrinal statement on the specific timing of the second coming, or is it more important that we simply believe in a literal second coming? And as always, I look forward to your responses and comments on the forum post. God bless.